I don't believe men were created to be pawns in someone else's game. I believe we were created to be steward kings. Men under authority, yes, but entrusted with real responsibility. Not perfect men, but disciplined ones. Men who rule themselves, serve God directly, and refuse to live in fear. This is king, not pawn. Look, look around our culture right now, and one thing becomes very obvious very quickly. Everything is a side. You're either on this team or that team, this ideology or that ideology, this tribe or that tribe. Politics, religion, culture, even entertainment. Every conversation seems to end the same way. Whose side are you on? And if you refuse to pick a side immediately, people get uncomfortable. But here's something that I don't think most people ever really stop to ask, and that's, what if constant division is not strength, but is actually a work of the flesh? Because in Galatians 5, Paul lists things like strife, dissensions, factions as works of the flesh. In other words, division itself can be sinful, you know, and even though division feels powerful, division is actually seductive because it gives you an instant identity. If you pick a tribe, you immediately know who your allies are, who your enemies are, who to defend, who to attack. It simplifies the world in some form, I suppose, but simplicity can also be deception because real life, guys, real life is very rarely that clean. So I'm sure you've seen this before. It could be, two people arguing online. Neither one is actually listening to the other, they're just defending their tribe. One side says something, the other side responds with sarcasm. It's this constant back and forth, hours of energy spent and nothing meaningful changes. There's no understanding that comes from it, no wisdom, just a deeper hostility. That's one of the fruits of division. And here's the thing, the flesh, it loves tribal identity because it removes personal responsibility. Because if your tribe is right, then you must be right. If your tribe is wrong, defend it anyway. Truth becomes secondary, loyalty becomes primary. And once loyalty to a group replaces, loyalty to truth, discernment, however much there may have been in the first place, I suppose, it disappears. You no longer ask, is this right? You start asking, is this good for my side? Jesus, when you look at his life, okay, he did not lead a tribe. Jesus didn't build a political faction. He didn't even rally people around an us versus them identity. He called people into something deeper, and that was the kingdom of God. And the kingdom does something unusual. It transcends tribes. It calls people from every background, every nation, every identity into one family under God. That kind of unity, it threatens systems built on division. And hey, look, division, it's profitable. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize, is that division makes money. Outrage sells. Anger keeps people engaged. The more divided a people are, the more they consume content that reinforces their side, which means many systems around you have a financial incentive to keep you angry. The more emotional you are, the more predictable you become. But a man who refuses to be manipulated by outrage, he is difficult to control. We've talked about this before. So just imagine for a second a group of people arguing intensely about politics. It shouldn't be all that hard to imagine because we see it all the time, right? Everyone's heated. Everyone is convinced that they are the ones that are right. Then someone enters the conversation calmly. That person doesn't immediately pick a side. He actually instead asks thoughtful questions. He acknowledges where each perspective may be partially right. And suddenly the tension shifts, not because he avoided truth, but because he refused to play the tribal game. That kind of man is rare and he's powerful. Look, division, it feeds the ego, it feeds pride. Because if your tribe is right, then you feel morally superior. If your opponents are wrong, then you, for whatever reason, feel justified in attacking them. But pride disguised as righteousness is still pride. And pride blinds people to their own errors. When a man believes his side can never be wrong, he stops seeking wisdom. In fact, I would actually argue that he probably abandons wisdom. Unity, okay, unity does not mean compromise. Okay, now we need to clarify something important here. Rejecting division does not mean tolerating evil, because unity does not mean pretending that everything is just fine and hunky dory. Okay, Jesus confronted corruption directly. He spoke hard truths, but his goal was restoration, not endless hostility. Okay, the difference is this: division seeks victory over enemies. Unity, on the other hand, it seeks the restoration of the people. This is why talking about peacemakers is so important, because Jesus said something remarkable on the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Blessed are the kingmakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Not peacekeepers, peacemakers. See, peacekeepers, they avoid conflict. Peacemakers address conflict in a way that restores order. And that is something that takes courage, because it often means challenging not just one side, but both sides. So, look, just imagine for a second a conversation where there are like two different groups demonizing each other. Okay, one side says they're all evil, the other says, well, they're all corrupt. Then someone says, well, both of you are partially right and partially wrong. That moment, it's going to disrupt the narrative, isn't it? Because division requires simple enemies, but the truth is often far more complex than that, and complexity threatens tribal loyalty. That's why steward kings, just as we're called, okay, they unite. A steward king, he does not thrive on division. He builds unity, not artificial unity, built on ignoring problems, but real unity based on truth. He seeks justice for the oppressed, okay? Correction for those who are wrong, mercy for the repentant, and cooperation wherever possible. Because a divided people are weak, but a united people are strong. Not to be trendy or cringe, but it's like those are the words that we need to hear today. Division it weakens a society. When division dominates a culture, several things happen. Trust collapses, institutions fracture, families argue endlessly. I mean, in some ways, communities will actually split into hostile camps, and eventually people stop seeing each other as neighbors and they see each other as enemies instead. That kind of future, it becomes unstable. History shows this repeatedly over the years. So just don't, This is what your responsibility is as a man, okay? Because you cannot control society, but what you can control is your own posture. You can choose not to demonize everyone who disagrees with you, not to just assume your tribe is perfect, not to participate in this endless outrage that we just see everywhere in the world on social media. Instead, I say that you can pursue truth, even if and when, because it will be a win, it corrects your own side. That requires humility. But humility, it's the foundation of wisdom. So look, division is easy, okay? It's loud, it's emotionally satisfying in the moment, but it rarely produces wisdom. The kingdom of God calls men to something higher. Truth without hatred, okay? Having conviction without being arrogant about it. And above all else, seeking unity by being a peacemaker, not keeper, without compromise. Okay, so do not become another voice shouting for your tribe. Become the man who seeks truth above sides. Because steward kings, they don't inflame division, they build order. And in a world addicted to conflict, the man who brings wisdom and unity becomes incredibly valuable.